So in that vein, I will kick it to our panelists, who are going to give just a 2-minute intro, what their issue is, how they got involved in that issue, and how they think it can help level the playing field for independent candidates and voters.
Hi, my name is Kyle Bailey. In 2016 and 2018, I led statewide referendum campaigns in the state of Maine to become the first state in the country to adopt ranked choice voting for statewide elections. In June, we had our first ranked choice voting election in the primaries, the first in the nation to use it. We used it in the Senate, congressional, governor, and state legislative races. And we'll use it for a second time this November, when Maine will become the first state in the nation to send members of Congress using ranked choice voting. And so a lot of exciting things happening in the state of Maine. It's a long and troubled story about how we got ranked choice voting. 9 of the last 11 elections for governor in our state, the candidate who won received less than 50% of the vote, and half of those races, the candidates who won got less than 40% of the vote. And over time, voters became frustrated with that. They looked at different reforms. Through the League of Women Voters and other groups, decided in a consensus process with advocates and policymakers that ranked choice voting was the best fit for our state. And in 2014, we had another contentious governor's election, which devolved into a conversation that was entirely about polling. What do the polls say? I don't want to waste my vote. And it became a conversation about voting for the lesser of two evils. And so that triggered a citizen initiative in our state. We launched a campaign, a handful of us who believed in this. We didn't have a bank account, let alone any money in it. We just decided it was the right thing to do and wanted to see if Mainers agreed. We collected the signatures, put it on the ballot, won with 52% of the vote in 2016. And then we ended up in 4 different legal battles, multiple legislative battles, and ultimately a second referendum to restore ranked choice voting because the legislature took what the people passed and repealed it. And so we put it back on the ballot. We have something called a people's veto. It's a way to actually overturn our legislature. And Maine people with 54% of the vote affirmed their support for ranked choice voting. Support for that reform in our state is growing. And it came really out of our state because of our long history, as I mentioned, of governor's races and other races where candidates are winning with less than a majority, and that feeling that some candidates may be winning who are opposed by a majority of voters. And you should never have to vote for the lesser of two evils when there's another candidate you really like. And that's the transformative effect of ranked choice voting. All the reforms that are being discussed here today and that the folks are pursuing are really important to our political process to change the rules, to level the playing field. I think ranked choice voting particularly is important because it levels the playing field for independent third-party candidates to compete. No longer can the parties say, you need to get out of the race because you're splitting the vote and preventing this other candidate from winning. So that the conversation we heard in the last panel and that we will hear again throughout the conversation here of that spoiler dynamic, that goes away with ranked choice voting. So you as a voter can walk in the voting booth, rank the candidates in order of your individual preference, knowing if your first choice can't win, your vote instantly counts for your second choice. And we have a consensus process where candidates are elected more broadly. We restore majority rule. We promote civility because negative campaigning can backfire when you have a chance to rank your true preferences. So this is a reform that's taking off across the country. We'll talk more about it, but excited to be here today. And I'm also part of the Unite America family through my work in independent politics. Managed my first independent campaign, helped with the independent campaign in 2009, mayor of Atlanta, and I'm running currently State Treasurer Terry Hayes, who's running for governor of Maine. I'm her campaign manager. So thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's a very exciting conference. My name is Dr. Jessie Fields. I'm a medical doctor. I work in the Harlem community. I'm affiliated with Mount Sinai Hospital. I also teach at the medical school there. And I became a physician because I wanted to change the conditions in the African American community and in poor communities. I grew up in such a community. And I found that I had to go outside the walls of the medical practice in order to do that. And when I did that, I met Dr. Lenore Fulani and in the independent movement at that point, which was in the late 1980s. She ran for president as an independent. As Jackie Salett said on the last panel, Dr. Fulani became the first woman and African American in U.S. history ever to be on the ballot in all 50 states, and she ran as an independent. I got involved at that time. And I think the thing that motivated me was that I saw how disenfranchised people were in the communities where I was practicing medicine, and I became involved in political reforms and reforms that we have supported in New York City, in particular, nonpartisan municipal elections and open primaries. And I'm on the board of open primaries, and I think that it is a key issue for our country in general, for all of our people, and in particular for people who have been so locked out. And the constituencies I'm talking about are ones that have been dominated by the Democratic Party, and the closed primary just makes elected officials completely unaccountable. So I do a lot of grassroots work in the communities, and we talk to people on the streets and ask them to sign petitions to open up the primaries. There's a charter revision commission in New York City going on right now, and we've been petitioning the chairs of the parties in New York State, the national chairs, to open the presidential primaries, which they could do. It's really a battle, particularly in New York, which is so dominated by the Democratic Party and so underserved by the party in many ways. So I think that part of my mission, and something I feel very inspired by, is connecting the long movement of the African American community, Native American community, other people of color, and poor people for equality, for inclusion, to have more opportunity. And our systems in education and health and housing have been such a dramatic failure. And that's the responsibility, that's the fault of the two parties and the political system, which has shut people out and has completely failed. So part of my mission is to bring together those communities into the independent movement. I think they're hungry for a new politic, for change. Whenever we talk to people, we go out. I'm going to be leaving tonight to go back to Harlem to be at Harlem Week. We do this every year. We get hundreds of people who say, yes, it's not fair that independents are shut out. Yes, we need other choices. What we have is not working. It's clearly not working. And so I think there's a lot of interest and receptivity to independent politics in those communities. And there is factually, statistically, a really high level of growth of independent politics in those communities among young people. And so I want to continue building that relationship because I think it's critical. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Katie Fahey. I'm from Michigan, and I'm here representing voters, not politicians. I'll start with what our issue is. So redistricting reform and gerrymandering. In Michigan in particular, why this is, I think, so important for independents is we've consistently, for decades, voted about 50% for Democrats, 50% for Republicans, and yet about a third or 40% of us consider ourselves independents. Yet, depending which party has been in charge of redistricting reform once every 10 years, you have upwards of a supermajority going to one party. So in our state Senate right now, even though they got actually less than 50% of the vote, they have 70% of the seat allocation. So when you have an extreme issue like that, you have a one party who doesn't even have to talk to the other side, you don't get a lot of cooperation there. But if our government was actually representative, if we actually had 50% going to each side, I mean, every single thing that would be happening would have to be a compromise, or nothing would be getting done. And it also makes an independent who could be there much more important. The other part is that about 90% of our statewide elections are not competitive after the primaries. So it leads to a lot of people feeling like it doesn't matter if they show up, it doesn't matter if their votes count, but also you get much more extreme candidates through the primary process. So just a lot of opportunity if we can actually create a system that's more representative of how people are actually voting. So how did I get here? Don't have a political background, have a sustainability and business background. But in 2016, I saw something really exciting happening. For the first time, my friends and family, who I was always begging to pay attention to issues and candidates, were starting to do that. I was at a dinner party and there was a discussion about Bernie Sanders, Hillary Clinton, and Donald Trump's healthcare policies and childcare policies. And my family and friends who never pay attention knew the differences. And to me, that got me really excited to see that people were talking. And when I tried to think about why, I really saw that talking about undoing the system, about these really big new ideas, whether it was from Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, were really resonating with the people of Michigan. And after the election, the unfortunate part was that everybody then started going back to, you voted this way, so you're evil, you voted this way, so you're evil. I was like, no, remember, these great dinner parties are happening. So when I was thinking about going to Thanksgiving dinner, I wanted us to not talk about candidates. I wanted us to keep talking about the issues where I could hear that we were all agreeing. So I made a Facebook post that said, hey, I want to take on gerrymandering in Michigan. If you want to help, let me know, smiley face. And I think the emoji was very key to our success. And what that has ended up leading to, just in brief, is a network of over 13,000 people who've signed up to volunteer, over 5,000 active day-to-day volunteers. And when I mean active, I mean I have data I can track on each of them. It's led to over 16,000 individual donations to our campaign, which is over 18 times more individual donations than any other ballot initiative in Michigan. And it's led to us being able to gather over 425,000 petition signatures in 110 days from all 83 Michigan counties for free with all volunteers. I mean, we had to pay for petitions, but and truly a movement where people are paying attention. We had a Supreme Court case recently. We filled the entire room, and we had hundreds of people waiting outside too. The transparency we're bringing to the process, because we're actually inviting people in, I think is another really key part to how these reforms happen. So I think that both how we're running the campaign, because we were regular people and we weren't gonna, buy into the party piece, and we wanted a nonpartisan, a truly good for any voter solution, and then also redistricting in general, both things that hopefully can help anybody who would like to talk about.
Well, good afternoon, good morning, good afternoon almost. My name is Amber McReynolds, and I have been the Director of Elections in Denver for the past 7 years. I've worked in the office for the past 13, so run 3 different presidential campaigns in the city and county of Denver, or elections in the city and county of Denver, over 30 elections as an election official. And my last day in Denver elections was actually Wednesday, and I'm now the Executive Director at National Vote at Home. And that new organization is going to be pushing the reforms that we have accomplished in Colorado over the past 5 years to make the voting process easier, including same-day registration, automatic registration processes, automatic balloting. So in Colorado, you get a ballot automatically to you as an active voter. And I'll talk in a second about how that has impacted independent voters. But I'm unaffiliated. I've been unaffiliated my entire career, which is a rarity, actually, as an election official. When you look across the country, most election officials at the local level, and then also the secretaries of state, leading the rules and setting the rules and regulations and engagement, are all partisan. So from a systematic perspective, I definitely believe that there's various things that need to happen in terms of the system and the process of elections and how balloting happens and how registration happens to make it easier for independents to engage in the process. One word of caution for you all, I moved out to Colorado about 13 years ago, and I actually first came here at a conference that I was attending for work. So be careful, because you may never leave. And many of us have ended up here in that way. But Colorado, in particular, is an interesting state, and in my tenure as an election official, when I came into the office, one of the things that I kept asking everyone that I worked with, and I came in as a 26-year-old who had come from a civic engagement role, I kept asking, why are we doing certain things a certain way? Why do you have to go to a polling place that you're assigned to? Why do you have to be registered to vote 30 days prior? And as I asked those questions, the answer was always, well, we've done it that way for 20 years, so we have to keep doing it that way. And to me, that wasn't satisfactory. So the way that I've approached election administration and then advocacy, and I've done a lot of advocacy work in Colorado, and now we'll do it on the national level. I fundamentally believe that we always should be focused on doing what's right for the voting population and making sure that there's an equal opportunity for everyone to participate in a meaningful way in the voting process. And the rules of engagement nationally, and I have a really great slide that looks like a monopoly board that I presented at Dan's summit in February, but the rules of engagement have been designed deliberately by the 2 major parties, and they effectually keep them in power one way or another. And so when you look at legislatures are ultimately the ones that set the policy and the rules of engagement across the board for how elections are in each state. And those are primarily partisan official. So when we go and say, hey, we want to change the law to make this particular thing better, often the immediate thought in those legislative bodies is, well, we just got elected this way. Why would we consider the rules of engagement to change? So we've had some good success here in Colorado because we've tried to be collaborative, bring people together across all different political persuasions to get reforms done, including the major reform that we made 5 years ago, which set up automatic balloting before every election to every active voter. So your ballot shows up in the mail to you if you're in Colorado. We eliminated all the registration deadlines, so you can register and vote up to Election Day in Colorado. And by the way, the top 6 states in the country for turnout in 2016 all have one common policy, and that is same-day registration, which is something we have here. Minnesota, Maine, New Hampshire, all of those top states have that one fundamental policy in place. And I can tell you in Colorado, the first time that we rolled that out for the 2016 election, and that was the first presidential, it disproportionately benefited independents. So on election day, of all the electors in Colorado that took advantage of same day, over 50% of them were independent. And that kind of also points out the issues with the system in that the parties and the reach and the number of hits that people that are associated with political parties get leading up to an election are disproportionately more because the parties are doing their outreach. There isn't necessarily a campaign that's outreaching to independents. So that fundamentally changed what that looked like. And both parties said, who did this reform benefit? Well, it benefited literally, I think it was, the Republicans and Democrats literally had exactly 25% each of the voters that used same day, and then independents were right about 50. But the biggest point there is the policy benefited every voter across the board, regardless of their political persuasion. And the same thing with automatic balloting. The way that, I'll use New York as an example. If you're in New York, there's very few options for early voting, very few options for absentee ballots or how to get those. If you're in Pennsylvania, you have to check off one of the reasons that you want to get an absentee ballot. Some states require you to get a notary and prove that you're going to be out of the jurisdiction for 12 hours on election day to get an early ballot. These types of reforms are put in place to essentially keep people out. And my whole thing as being an election official, a lot of these things are very niche, they're very detailed, and you have to know where to find all of these things to then make the appropriate reforms. So that's what we've tried to do here. I'm all about doing what's right by the voters and not squabbling about who's right in the legislative process. So happy to be here, happy that you're in Denver, and welcome to our amazing city.
Hello, I'm Dan Krassner. I'm the political director at Represent Us. I come from the rigged political system. Spent the first half of my career on the other side of what this panel is all about. I was the chief strategy officer for the Florida Chamber of Commerce, the largest political giver and lobbying group in my home state. I saw how our lobbyists hand-delivered checks. We wrote the bills on behalf of, as a front group for big corporations. We set the agenda. We even with Blackberries would tell the legislators what to say in the committee meetings. It was a totally rigged process, a process that where at the same time headlines were ethics bill dies slow death. So grateful to my wife Nicole who helped me see a better way. In 2012 we began working on anti-corruption reform in Florida. In 2014 joined Represent Us. Agree with all the comments so far. Dr. Fields, talking about the system failing. I think we can agree that's a big part of why we're here, system failure. Agree with Katie about Thanksgiving. It's great to be able to go home to Florida and a Thanksgiving table filled with Trump supporters, Clinton supporters, none of the above supporters, and talk about unrigging the system, talking about anti-corruption reform, talking about country over party, and have conversations that everyone can participate in a civil way. Amber, thank you for mentioning the Unrig the System Summit in New Orleans. I see this summit as a really important next conversation, and we need more of these convenings, bringing people across the political spectrum. With Represent Us, we believe that America should work for everyone, not just a handful of billionaires and special interests. Clearly it's not. We have system failure. To get a system that works for everyone, we need to build a bigger tent. It's just a math issue. As I've worked on anti-corruption victories, that's 2 minutes. I'll save the rest for later.
Great, okay. Here we are. So I've got one question and then we'll just kick it straight to the audience, but we can pass down, go down the line again, or just have a couple folks answer, but we all know, and we've talked in basically every panel, there's this premise of dissatisfaction with the parties, with the system, with the results. How do we translate that to positive reform? Be it for independence, for the system as a whole, for the way we conduct elections, the way we hold our elected officials accountable. How do we go from dissatisfaction to progress and reform? What's the greatest obstacle that you guys face in your various respective roles? Is it the two parties and the structure that has been built by the two parties? Is it misinformation that's put out there into the world by a lot of different voices? Is it just the fact that you're trying to do, in some cases, complicated things? Explaining ranked choice voting to people the first time is probably, that's something you're against until you understand how it happens, right? And then you're all for it. So what's your greatest obstacle as you pursue the various reforms that you are pursuing? Kai, you can start.
Sure. Well, I think you hit the nail on the head, which is that I don't think most people know in their gut our political system is wrong. And there's some things we can point to, like money. We know money in politics is a problem. But I don't think most people in their daily lives think a lot about these process reforms. And they're not always the sexiest thing. But I think we have a responsibility to bring these issues forward and talk more about them and raise the level of debate and consciousness. I've consistently said in Maine, where we had growing opposition to ranked choice voting over time from partisan special interests, was they weren't our biggest challenge or our threat. Our biggest challenge was educating voters about what ranked choice voting is, how it works, and why it matters. And even more importantly, having voters understand that the way you've always voted isn't the way you have to vote going forward. There are other solutions. And if you want better outputs, you've got to have better inputs, right? If you want a government that actually solves problems, then you need a better system that rewards consensus-oriented candidates, that rewards civility, that gives voters more voice and more choice and more power, and that fundamentally change the equation, right? So you get a different outcome. And I think once you have those conversations with voters, I mean, we talked to 150,000 voters in our state door to door in our first campaign. We walked away with 65 to 70% support for ranked choice voting. People wanted to see the ballot, but more importantly, they wanted to understand what does it mean for them as a voter. And a lot of them really hadn't thought about these issues before, right? They're dealing with they're dealing with healthcare costs exploding. They're dealing with their kids in schools and challenges with education. They're paying their taxes. These are the day-to-day issues that people think about, right? And that are the topics of conversation. And yes, there are obstacles that are put into place by partisan and special interests to this, but if we can, and we prove this in Maine, if you go out to voters, educate them, and build a grassroots coalition, no special interest or partisan interest can stop you. It's unstoppable. Joel talked about this earlier. It's a movement, right? Movements are unstoppable. As long as you have really committed people who are smart, strategic, and working hard and trying to organize and harness that energy, that's what we experienced in Maine, and what we did in Maine can work all across the country. So I think that's kind of my 2 cents on that.
Let me just say, I think there's, to try to organize my thoughts, I think there's 3 things that that I want to touch on that are significant obstacles to winning reforms. One is exactly what Kyle just said about people dealing day to day with very hard issues, with their families and the schools not working, et cetera, joblessness, crime, violence, and so people sort of naturally think of these issues as being the fundamental issues. They're certainly important and they have to be addressed. But what we try to talk about is that relationship between the political process and the failure of the political process and the fact that people are not represented, that the process is not fair, that it's not inclusive, that it's not representative, and are not, and the monopoly, the partisanship of the two parties, and are not being able to address those issues and how important it is for people to be involved in building something new at the grassroots. And that takes time. It takes talking to people, and I think so that's one thing. The other thing is that we elected an African-American president. He was not an independent, although many people thought he was. Independence, he talked about partisanship and changing the culture of politics and bringing people together, and that was very exciting. I certainly supported that and supported him. But it didn't turn out, it didn't really work out fundamentally. The partisanship just got worse. And he, as an independent, some of the things we did, we asked him to support open primaries. He won because of open primaries. If it hadn't been for open primaries and independents being able to vote for him in the Democratic primaries, he would not have been the Democratic Party nominee. And then independents supported him in the general election. So, we asked him to support that, to support other kinds of reforms, opening up the boards of elections, the Federal Election Commission, etc. But he didn't. And, perhaps it's because our movement wasn't big enough, or he just, didn't think that way. He really wasn't, I think, an independent in that way in terms of his culture. He had really, anyway, for whatever reasons, that didn't happen. So I think there's a sense of cynicism, of frustration that we did that, and now we have the president that we have. And so, there's a kind of reflex that, people become cynical, they stop participating. There's a lot of people who aren't participating. There was over 1 million African Americans who voted for Obama in 2008 and 2012 who did not vote in 2016, and that was part of what happened in the result of the election. They didn't like the choices. They didn't see the Democratic Party nominee, Hillary Clinton, as anything but a continuation of the establishment. So I think the other thing is the two parties. It's very tough. We had some real successes in New York City. We supported Mike Bloomberg. He was elected because he was on the Independence Party ticket. He got his margin of victory on the Independence line in 2001. I ran for Manhattan Borough President as an independent on the same ticket. And he supported nonpartisan elections. He put a Charter Revision Commission in place. We worked very hard to win nonpartisans, but the Democratic Party machine fought against it tooth and nail, including lying about it, that it was going to elect rich Republicans and so forth. So the machines, the parties themselves, are a tremendous challenge, and the backlash. In 2005, we got 47% of the African American vote for Mike Bloomberg running as an independent and on the independent and the Republican line. 47% of the African American community in New York City voted for someone who was not a Democrat. Was that covered in the newspapers the next day? No. Do people know that? No, not really. Even the people who voted for Bloomberg don't know that was such a big thing. So the movement is, we're grassroots, we're growing, but we face these challenges. And after we did that, the Democratic Party in particular came after the Independence Party, demanded that the independents from New York, myself and others who were working with Dr. Fulani and had a long history with independent politics, be thrown out of the party. It was a big fight, and it was because we were successful. And they come after you if you are successful. And so those are some of the challenges.
I think it's trying to bring reform. In Michigan, we're lucky to have a citizen-led ballot initiative process, so that's exciting. We can work kind of around the legislature, but working within the system that is so broken is probably the number one obstacle. Trying to have an actually nonpartisan campaign, trying to find the right consultants, everybody's a Democrat or a Republican, all that kind of systemic stuff where you, especially if you're unknown, you're going to get painted in the newspapers as actually a secret Democrat or a secret Republican or whatever, and it takes away, it moves the conversation away from the fact that this reform that we're proposing is actually a fair, impartial, and transparent system. And also within that, I think that, you know, we had people who would give us support, and then they would hear from the party that if they did, they would never work in, you know, the town again, in Michigan again. And there's a really strong retaliation sense from both parties that's very entrenched, and people are very scared to be courageous and try and step outside of it. It probably really helped that I had a day job outside of politics when we were starting this, because I was unafraid completely. I was here representing the people of Michigan to try and make something happen. And the other aspect I would say, especially from a grassroots campaign, we started from a Facebook post, also without a bank account, and a real understanding of which way we were going to go. But you know, when you hear that in an election similar to the one that you're expecting, $33 million was spent against a ballot initiative, and even if you have a bunch of individual donors, it's intimidating, and it also makes a lot of people not want to necessarily invest too. So it takes a lot of time, thoughtfulness, and innovation. So I definitely think you can go around it, but helping people feel comfortable, especially a lot of people for the first time engaging in politics who are a little scared and feel like they shouldn't be there. You really have to create a culture and an environment that says, not only should you be here, but if you don't show up, this isn't happening. It's completely true, you know. I did the math, me and my coworker did, and if we would have both quit our jobs, we'd have to gather 3,000 signatures a day just ourselves for, you know, a bunch of days. So there's no way to do it on your own, and helping people see that no matter what their skill is, they can come to the table is another part where, you know, you always have politicians saying, just trust me, I'll fix everything. And for actual citizens, there's not a lot of pushback on saying, but you have to show up too. And I think changing all of those mentalities to help people even be able to dream that things can be different, that they maybe could trust a system again within the government, has probably been the number one obstacle. But I'm happy to report that we've got a lot of momentum that's moving in the right direction, and I hope that we win in November.
Well, for me, and as an election official for 13 years, I think the structure that exists right now for election administration is probably the greatest strategic reform that needs to happen. In 2016, if did not vote would have been on the presidential ballot, it would have won in almost all states except for 5, Colorado being one of them, and all the top 6 states for turnout. That would not have been the case, but everywhere else it would have. And the other thing is the residual vote rate, meaning that people actually voted a ballot in 2016 but undervoted for president, is the highest that we've ever seen. So that should tell everyone in here that the system itself is leaving people out, right? And I don't know, and maybe I'll just ask for a show of hands, who loves their voting experience? Who thinks it's easy? Who thinks do they look forward to it? Are you all from Colorado? Okay, right, okay.
None from New York.
So that wasn't even 30% of the room that raised their hands. But one thing I'll say, like, since I've been here in Denver, we did our reform in 2013. We've seen a higher turnout than what we had then. We've seen a 45% increase in independent registrations since in that 5-year period. Colorado's now about 39% unaffiliated. The 2 major parties are right around 29 and 30%. We have a high satisfaction rate amongst voters, so this sort of idea of delivering a ballot automatically. I never thought that I would get to a place in our election office from when I started in 2005 to get thank you notes inside of ballot packets coming back to us for moving from other places, and this being the 5th place they lived, and now they have an easy experience. So breaking down the barriers of this process and making it easier is to me the strategic priority that needs to happen for this to be easier just for the electorate generally. Second piece on that, the primary reform across the country needs to happen. We just went through a citizen-led initiative in Colorado in 2016. Prop 107 and 108 basically passed, and it was citizen-driven because the legislature rejected the proposal the year before. And it passed, and basically what it did is it said unaffiliateds can come into the presidential and the state primary process. Well, sure enough, then the following year after that passed, last year in the legislature felt they needed to do implementing rules, and there were certain things that needed to be implemented, but as part of that initiative that they did, they added restrictions. So you had to, if you were unaffiliated and you're going to participate, we have to record which party you chose now in your public record. So even though unaffiliateds were invited in and citizens passed an initiative, the legislature added restrictions on top of that to basically expose unaffiliateds to be Republican or Democrat, because the two major parties wanted that data. And I was one of the only ones testifying against that at the legislature, and some of my very best friends are very involved in both sides politically, and I was chatting with one of them outside the hearing room, and this sort of illustrates why this matters so much. But I said to her, you know, I'm here for the voters, and the voters passed this initiative, and everybody should have an equal opportunity to this. The initiative that was passed by the voters didn't call for this labeling and this preference. And she said, well, I'm not here for all voters, I'm here for my clients. And you know, I won't say who it was, I won't say which side it was, but a very dear friend. And that for me, doing this for 12 years at that time, it was very disappointing to hear that there was someone that I had always thought was so much for the voters that actually wasn't when it came down to it. And so I think that fundamentally illustrates kind of what we are dealing with. We're dealing with a system that basically builds up the two major parties, and nothing bad about the parties. They can still operate, but in the election administration world, and you getting your ballot and you being able to participate, it has to be free from partisan politics. One final example, and this is in the recent news, Kansas, the Kansas primary, about a week ago. And I keep getting asked to comment on this from an administration perspective, but there were significant numbers of unaffiliated ballots rejected because the poll workers told them the wrong information, because of course it's very confusing. You have to fill out one form and then you get a provisional. Well, a good number of independents didn't get handed one form. They did their provisional appropriately and marked down the party they wanted to vote on, but they didn't get the party preference form. So their ballots ultimately got rejected because they didn't fill out this one form that was never presented to them by the poll workers, right? So this is why these details in the election process, and if you haven't been a poll worker or you haven't gone in and toured your election office, I would encourage you to do so and ask questions about how these things work, because this is where it happens. This is where people's ballots either get accepted or rejected, or they get to vote or they don't. And this is how this changes. You can't change it if it's not fair for everybody at the start.
To unrig the system, we have to do three things. One, we need to build a bigger tent to win on policy reform. It's just a math issue. You've got the country about a third identifying liberal, a third moderate, a third conservative, and as you know, more than 40% view themselves as independents. Independents are essential in winning and unrigging the system. Two, we've got to get past this solution, this one silver bullet will solve all of our problems and unrig the system. Every solution this panel's talking about, you're hearing today, need to be in the mix and part of this effort. Three, we have to build a powerful movement, and it was good conversation this morning. I agree with Nick about the psychology being a big barrier, and I'd ask you all to go back home and let your neighbors know and your networks know that this is a movement on the rise. This is a movement that is winning. We've seen more than 80 anti-corruption victories across America. I've had the honor to help out in wins in Florida, in South Dakota, and Alaska, and we couldn't do it without independents like Representative Jason Grenn in Alaska, who is the sponsor of the Alaska Anti-Corruption Act. There was a people-powered ballot measure. They gathered the signatures, 45,000 of them, and it forced the legislature to finally take action on issues on ethics and accountability that were stalled for years. This is a movement winning in Ohio with passage of anti-gerrymandering with 75% of the vote in Maine. Kyle's great effort with ranked choice, 75% of the vote in Ohio with anti-gerrymandering. Maine in June the next month with protecting ranked choice voting and having the first statewide election in America. In July was that Alaska win. What Katie has on the ballot in Michigan, you know, the people power to gather more than 425,000 signatures with no money. It was just so awesome, and I'm proud of our members that lent a hand in that volunteer effort. We calculate nearly 100 political reform efforts at the state and local level all across America happening this year, right now. There's another series of anti-gerrymandering reforms on the ballot, qualified for the ballot, in Colorado, in Utah, in Missouri, This year, along with Michigan, there are anti-corruption acts on the ballot in South Dakota and North Dakota. You can go to unrigsummit.com/map and see the nearly 100 efforts. So, let's go back and tell our networks, hey, this is a movement on the rise. We're winning. There's more political reform happening this year in 2018 than we've seen since post-Watergate. And us as independents in the room, we're the glue. We're the group that can actually convene, like Representative Jason Grin did in Alaska, and say, hey, Democrats, come to the table. Hey, Republicans, come to the table. Can we agree that corruption's bad? Can we agree that gerrymandering's bad? Can we agree that we should have more voice and more choice in elections? All these solutions, you all can be the conveners of the effort to unrig the system, state by state, city by city, and eventually to Washington, D.C.
Great, Dan, that was a great summary. We have time for one quick question. We have 17 hands in the air. Okay, let's go right here in the front row.
So that kind of relates just to my question, mostly to Dan and to Kyle. So if it's so evident to the Democrats and Republicans that, look, this stuff is like morally bad, right, rigging the system, all that stuff, and if the Maine people spoke up and the legislator struck it down twice, I mean, what are they thinking? Don't they feel like don't they know that they will be accountable and voted out if they're not doing the will of the people? Don't they have a sense of like, because I'm like, either they got balls or they're like completely idiotic. How did
I guess the short answer is no. The problem is lack of competition, means that there's a lack of accountability. If you can draw your own district and receive significant special interest money and dark money spent on your behalf in a system where you can win with first past the post, and the rules are in such a way that makes it harder for independents to participate in those primaries, right? So all these things stack the deck so that you just keep playing to your base, right? The problem is these candidates become increasingly accountable to a smaller and smaller faction of voters, right? And with all these different scenarios, they can continue to win, right? And until we start to, and that's why, I think the independent and reform work go hand in hand, because I can tell you in Maine, ranked choice voting was successful in large part because we had a history of independents running for office and raising the level of consciousness about the need for a reform to address vote splitting, et cetera, right? So these things go hand in hand, and independents need these reforms, and the reforms need the independents. But I don't think that that's the case. There are good people in both parties who believe that there are problems, but a lot of the leadership isn't coming from within those institutions. One of the things we did in Maine is we organized at the local level. So we, people who followed Maine and ranked choice voting maybe saw some of the partisan rancor around it this last go around. Some people will say, well, Democrats support, Republicans opposed it. The Democrats supported it because we worked our way around all the Democratic lobbyists and party leaders and got the grassroots organized, right? So you have to change that culture, and this is the underlying problem that's systematic in our entire system, with regardless of what issues you care about as well getting resolved, is these things layer on and limit that accountability. And so that's why we need independents to run for office. We need to have ranked choice voting, we need to have nonpartisan redistricting, we need to tackle money in politics, we need to make it easier for people to participate in the political process, because when we do all those things, and I know it can seem daunting to have to do all those different things, but I think the point was made earlier in the discussion today that when talking about the civil rights movement, that there was an overarching movement, but there were little pockets within that were driving different pieces and working in different ways. And so we have to see ourselves in that way and come together. And I think that's what's exciting for me about what Unite America is doing in this summit and others, is the opportunity for us to come together and talk about those things, share best practices, support one another, and focus on what can we do in our communities and our states to make that difference, because we all do that. We can have a transformative effect on our politics, and that's how we introduce. I often said that our themes in Maine were more voice and more choice. You want more voice, you got to have more choice. These things go hand in hand, and we have a responsibility, I think all of us as advocates, to go into our communities and have these conversations, because voters are there, they are hungry for change, right? But there are barriers in place, and we have an opportunity to educate folks about those barriers and build coalitions to break them.